In the aftermath of the First World War, the political map of Eastern Europe underwent profound changes. The collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917 and the subsequent Russian Civil War created a power vacuum in its western borderlands. In 1918, Bessarabia, a predominantly rural province between the Prut and Dniester rivers, declared union with the Kingdom of Romania. The Romanian government, backed by Allied recognition at the 1920 Treaty of Paris, incorporated the territory, though the Soviet government never accepted this transfer, maintaining its claim to Bessarabia as part of the former Russian imperial lands. Northern Bukovina, historically part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was annexed by Romania in 1918 following the empire's dissolution, adding another point of contention with Moscow after the Soviet Union emerged from the Civil War. Throughout the interwar years, these territorial disputes remained unresolved. Soviet diplomacy continued to reject Romania's sovereignty over Bessarabia, while Romania integrated the region administratively and militarily, extending its laws, gendarmerie, and land reforms into the area. The population of Bessarabia, around 2.8 million by the late 1930s, was ethnically mixed. Moldovans, Romanian speakers, formed a majority, alongside Ukrainians, Russians, Jews, Bulgarians, and Gagauz. Northern Bukovina, with roughly 800,000 inhabitants, was similarly diverse, comprising Ukrainians, Romanians, Poles, Jews, and Germans. Economic development was limited, with agriculture dominating production, while infrastructure lagged behind Romania's western regions. By the late 1930s, the rise of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, as revisionist powers, reshaped the strategic environment. The August 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty between Germany and the USSR, included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. In this arrangement, Bessarabia was placed in the Soviet sphere. Although no immediate action was taken, the pact signaled a potential Soviet move against Romanian-held territories when circumstances allowed. Romania, at the time a constitutional monarchy under King Carol II, sought to preserve its territorial integrity through balancing diplomacy. Its alliances with France and Britain offered nominal security guarantees, but these were undermined after the fall of France in June 1940. Romania's military, numbering about 500,000 personnel on paper, faced severe equipment shortages, with much of its arsenal dating from the First World War. Armor consisted of fewer than 200 light tanks, and the Air Force fielded a mix of obsolete biplanes and a limited number of modern fighters, such as the PZL P-24. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, had consolidated control over its western borderlands after the invasion of eastern Poland in September 1939 and the occupation of the Baltic states in June 1940. These moves expanded Soviet forward bases and brought large Red Army formations closer to Romanian territory. In June 1940, with France defeated and Britain isolated, Moscow issued an ultimatum to Bucharest, demanding the cession of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. The Romanian High Command, recognizing the impossibility of resisting the USSR without external support, advised compliance. On 28 June 1940, the Romanian army began a hasty withdrawal from the provinces. The Soviet occupation proceeded rapidly. The Red Army deployed elements of the 9th and 12th Armies, totaling approximately 46,000 troops, supported by over 3,000 tanks and armored vehicles. The Romanian forces, about 16,000 in the affected sectors, were under orders to avoid direct confrontation, though incidents of sporadic armed clashes and harassment occurred during the retreat. Soviet units entered Chisinau, Cernăuți, and other major towns within days, raising the Soviet flag and initiating administrative takeover. Under Soviet administration, Bessarabia and parts of Bukovina were reorganized into the Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic and the Chernivtsi Oblast of the Ukrainian SSR. The annexation brought sweeping political and social changes. Land was redistributed under collectivization policies. Private trade was curtailed, and local institutions were replaced with Soviet structures. Political repression followed swiftly, with arrests targeting former Romanian officials, landowners, clergy, and individuals labeled as class enemies. Archival estimates indicate that between 1940 and early 1941, tens of thousands were deported to Siberia and Central Asia. The rapid Sovietization process, coupled with the disruption of the pre-war economy, generated discontent among segments of the local population, though others, particularly among poorer peasants and some minority groups, viewed Soviet policies as an opportunity for social advancement. The loss of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina deeply affected Romanian national policy. In Bucharest, the cession was perceived as a humiliation and a direct consequence of Romania's diplomatic isolation. The territory's strategic position, providing a bridgehead toward the lower Danube and the Carpathians, meant their loss also posed a security threat. By the autumn of 1940, King Carol II had abdicated in favor of his son, Michael I, while General Ion Antonescu assumed power, aligning Romania more closely with Nazi Germany. The stage was set for the country's participation in the coming Axis invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, aimed in part at reclaiming these lost provinces. On 22 June 1941, the Axis invasion of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, began. Romania, now a formal member of the Axis alliance, committed itself to the campaign with the stated objective of regaining Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. Under Marshal Ion Antonescu's leadership, Romanian forces were integrated into the German Army Group South, under the command of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. The Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies, totaling approximately 3,000 personnel, were deployed alongside the German 11th Army, with the Prut River forming the starting line for operations into Soviet-held territory. The Soviet defense in the region was organized under the Southern Front, commanded by General Ivan Tyulenev. This included elements of the 9th and 18th Armies, reinforced by mechanized corps, and fortified sectors constructed since the 1940 annexation. Despite these preparations, the Red Army in Bessarabia was still in the process of mobilization and redeployment when the invasion began, creating vulnerabilities in its defensive network. Romanian and German forces commenced the offensive with concentrated artillery barrages and airstrikes, targeting Soviet positions in key sectors such as Iași, Ungheni, and Cahul. The Romanian Air Force, operating primarily IAR-80 fighters and Savoia Marchetti, SM-79 bombers, coordinated with the Luftwaffe to achieve local air superiority. Initial ground assaults focused on securing bridgeheads across the Prut River. By 24 June, Axis forces had established crossings at multiple points, despite determined Soviet counterattacks employing T-26 and BT-7 tanks, as well as entrenched infantry. The advance through Bessarabia was met with varying degrees of resistance. In the north, Romanian units encountered heavy opposition near Lipcani and Brăsini, where Soviet fortified lines slowed progress and inflicted significant casualties. Further south, in the direction of Chișinău, the German 11th Army's motorized elements pressed forward rapidly, forcing Soviet withdrawals from forward positions. The Soviet command attempted to regroup along the Dniester River, using the terrain's natural defensive features, but Axis pressure disrupted these plans. Civilian populations in contested areas were caught between retreating Soviet units and advancing Axis forces. Villages along the front lines experienced shelling and air raids, while roads were clogged with military convoys, refugees, and requisitioned livestock. Some inhabitants, particularly those who had suffered under Soviet deportations in 1940-1941, welcomed the Romanian return, while others feared reprisals or were uncertain of the new political order. Reports from both sides noted instances of looting, property destruction, and rapid resource extraction as control shifted. By early July, the Axis had made significant territorial gains, with Romanian and German troops advancing toward Chișinău and Cernăuți. Soviet resistance stiffened around these urban centers, where NKVD units coordinated with regular army forces to delay the offensive. Fighting in the approaches to Chișinău involved street-level skirmishes and the demolition of bridges to hinder Axis armor. Nevertheless, the coordination between Romanian infantry and German mechanized formations gradually overcame these defenses. The northern sector, covering northern Bukovina, saw a simultaneous push by Romanian forces under General Nicolae Țiupercă, supported by German units, to reclaim the territory. The battle for Cernăuți involved encirclement maneuvers designed to cut Soviet escape routes toward the northeast. On 5 July, Axis forces entered the city, encountering scattered resistance before establishing control. This marked the restoration of Romanian administration in the region, at least temporarily. Throughout this phase, logistics played a critical role. Romanian supply lines relied on overextended road networks, while the Germans prioritized fuel and ammunition for their own armored spearheads moving deeper into Ukraine. The summer heat, combined with dust and the strain on transport, slowed some operations, yet the overall Axis momentum remained strong. By mid-July, with Chișinău captured and most of Bessarabia under Axis control, the focus began to shift toward operations east of the Dniester, marking the transition from territorial recovery to deeper involvement in the Eastern Front campaign. With the capture of Chișinău and Cernăuți in early July 1941, Romanian forces achieved the primary political objective set before the invasion, the recapture of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. Yet, under the terms of their alliance with Nazi Germany, Romanian troops were not withdrawn after securing the Prut-Dniester line. Instead, Marshal Antonescu committed to further offensive operations eastward, supporting the German drive toward the Black Sea coast and the Ukrainian interior. This decision was influenced by multiple factors: a desire to prove Romania's value as an Axis partner, the expectation of securing additional territorial or economic benefits, and pressure from Berlin to maintain continuous engagement. In operational terms, the Romanian Fourth Army, commanded by General Nicolae Țiupercă, was tasked with advancing southward toward the Dniester estuary and the strategic port city of Odessa. The Romanian Third Army, under General Petre Dumitrescu, moved in coordination with German units along the Dniester's northern stretches, pushing toward Mogilev-Podolski. German command integrated Romanian divisions into corps-level formations for specific objectives, often assigning them to secure flanks, hold captured territory, or clear bypass Soviet pockets. The Soviet Southern Front, reeling from the loss of Bessarabia, reorganized its forces for a defensive stand. Reinforcements from interior military districts began arriving, including fresh rifle divisions, artillery brigades, and Black Sea Fleet coastal defense units. Odessa, in particular, was fortified as a major stronghold, with extensive trench networks, minefields, and reinforced bunkers prepared around its perimeter. Soviet naval assets supported the city's defense by providing artillery fire from the sea and transporting supplies and reinforcements along the coast. While the Axis advanced eastward, Romanian administration began re-establishing itself in the retaken provinces. Civil authorities moved quickly to replace Soviet institutions, reintroducing Romanian law, currency, and education systems. Land that had been collectivized under Soviet rule was partially returned to previous owners, though the chaos of war and lack of official records led to disputes and uneven restitution. In Chișinău, government buildings were repaired for administrative use, while the gendarmerie resumed policing duties. However, the security situation remained unstable, with reports of sabotage, armed resistance, and partisan activity in rural areas. These actions were often organized by remnants of the Soviet NKVD, who had left behind small cells to disrupt Axis control. The change in regime also brought reprisals. Individuals associated with Soviet administration, including local officials, Communist Party members, and collaborators, were subject to arrest, interrogation, or deportation. Jewish communities, already targeted by anti-Semitic legislation enacted in Romania before the war, faced new persecution, including forced labor and mass arrests. These measures were justified by Romanian authorities as security precautions, but they deepened divisions within the civilian population and added a layer of fear to everyday life in the occupied territories. Logistical challenges mounted as the front moved eastward. The Romanian army's equipment shortages became more apparent the further it operated from home supply depots. Motor transport was insufficient to meet operational needs, forcing reliance on horse-drawn wagons for much of the supply chain. Ammunition resupply depended heavily on German-controlled railways, which prioritized German formations advancing toward the Dnieper. Fuel shortages limited the mobility of Romanian armored units, already few in number and equipped with light tanks vulnerable to Soviet anti-tank weapons. The summer heat posed another difficulty. Dust clouds on unpaved roads reduced visibility and impaired air operations, while high temperatures strained both men and animals. Disease, especially dysentery and typhus, began to affect troop strength. Despite these obstacles, Axis forces pressed forward, buoyed by the broader German successes across the Eastern Front, where Army Group Center was driving towards Smolensk, and Army Group North was advancing on Leningrad. By late July, Romanian and German units were approaching the outer defenses of Odessa, where the Soviet command had concentrated significant forces to prevent a breach. Intelligence estimates suggested that over 3,000 Soviet troops were garrisoned in the city, supported by naval artillery and anti-aircraft guns. This marked the beginning of a new, protracted phase of the campaign, one that would test the Romanian army's capacity for sustained offensive operations against a well-prepared and determined enemy. The approach to Odessa in late July 1941 marked a transition from mobile warfare to a static, siege-style confrontation. The Romanian Fourth Army, reinforced for this operation, now comprised approximately 18 infantry divisions, 1 cavalry division, and supporting artillery regiments, altogether around 34,000 personnel. These forces were deployed along a semicircular front to the northwest, north, and northeast of the city, with the Black Sea forming Odessa's southern boundary. German participation was limited to specialized support units and liaison officers, as the Wehrmacht prioritized its own offensives farther east. The Soviet defense of Odessa was under the command of the separate coastal army, led by Lieutenant General Georgy Sofronov, numbering about 34,500 troops at the outset, with additional reinforcements arriving by sea during the siege. The defenders benefited from extensive fortifications, including 3 defensive belts consisting of trenches, barbed wire, minefields, and concrete bunkers. Artillery positions were well sited to cover likely approaches, while the Black Sea Fleet provided heavy gunfire support from cruisers, destroyers, and shore batteries. The port itself allowed for continuous resupply and evacuation, a critical factor in sustaining resistance. Romanian operational planning called for simultaneous pressure along multiple sectors to stretch Soviet defenses. On 8 August 1941, the siege began with preparatory artillery bombardments, targeting known strongpoints and suspected artillery emplacements. Initial infantry probes met stiff resistance, with Soviet machine gun nests and well-camouflaged mortar positions inflicting heavy casualties. Attempts to breach the first defensive belt in the Dalnik and Tatarka sectors were repelled, forcing the Romanian command to reconsider tactics. Logistics quickly emerged as a central challenge. Supplying hundreds of thousands of troops in a fixed position required continuous movement of ammunition, food, and medical supplies along roads vulnerable to Soviet air and artillery attacks. The Romanian Air Force and Luftwaffe units stationed in the area attempted to disrupt Soviet naval supply lines by bombing the port and targeting transport ships, but Soviet fighter cover and anti-aircraft fire limited the effectiveness of these raids. Meanwhile, Soviet submarines operated in the Black Sea, threatening Axis shipping to coastal supply points. In mid-August, the Romanians launched a concentrated assault on the eastern approaches to the city, aiming to sever the Odessa-Ovidiopol road and cut one of the main Soviet supply arteries. The attack, supported by heavy artillery and limited tank units, succeeded in capturing several forward positions, but failed to achieve a full breakthrough. Soviet counterattacks, coordinated with naval gunfire, restored parts of the line and inflicted significant losses on Romanian infantry battalions. Civilian life within Odessa during the siege was marked by severe hardship, but also a degree of organization under Soviet control. Rationing was imposed on food and fuel, medical services were centralized, and able-bodied civilians were mobilized for fortification work, firefighting, and supply handling. Propaganda broadcasts urged residents to resist the invader and highlighted Soviet successes on other fronts to maintain morale. Despite shortages and constant shelling, the city's port remained operational, and Soviet engineers repaired damage from air raids to keep supply routes open. By early September, the Romanian High Command, under pressure from both operational losses and the slow pace of progress, sought to intensify the siege. Artillery concentrations were increased, with heavy guns brought forward to within range of the Second Defensive Belt. New infantry assaults were planned, with the aim of wearing down Soviet forces through attrition, rather than relying on a single decisive breakthrough. This approach reflected both the strength of the Soviet fortifications and the limited offensive capacity of Romanian forces without large-scale German mechanized support. In parallel, German forces operating further east captured key positions in the lower Dnieper region, threatening to outflank Soviet defenses in southern Ukraine. This development would eventually influence the fate of Odessa, but in September 1941, the siege remained a costly, grinding battle in which neither side could claim decisive advantage. For Romania, the campaign represented both a test of military endurance and a political commitment to its Axis alliance, while for the Soviet Union, Odessa had become a symbol of resistance on the Black Sea coast. September 1941 brought a shift in the dynamics around Odessa as the siege entered its second month. The Romanian Fourth Army had managed to push closer to the Second Defensive Belt, but progress came at a heavy price. Daily casualty reports showed mounting losses, both in infantry and artillery crews, as the defenders maintained a high volume of fire from entrenched positions. Romanian divisions such as the 1st, 4th, and 11th Infantry reported companies reduced to half strength after repeated assaults. The limited number of Romanian tanks, primarily R2 light models, were vulnerable to Soviet anti-tank guns, forcing attacks to rely heavily on infantry and artillery. Soviet defensive strategy was increasingly shaped by coordination between land forces and the Black Sea Fleet. Warships, including the cruiser Krasny Krim and several destroyers, regularly shelled Romanian positions from offshore, forcing the attackers to disperse artillery and use camouflage to avoid counter-battery fire. At night, Soviet transports and escort vessels brought reinforcements and supplies into Odessa's harbor, sustaining the defenders despite the Axis blockade on land. Naval infantry units, trained for both coastal defense and counterattacks, were rotated into threatened sectors to restore the front after Romanian gains. On the Romanian side, Marshal Ion Antonescu visited the front in mid-September to assess the situation and boost morale. His orders emphasized the need to break Soviet resistance quickly, both for strategic and political reasons. The prolonged operation was consuming resources at a rate that strained Romania's capacity, and German High Command was urging the redeployment of Romanian units for further operations along the Black Sea coast. Antonescu authorized the use of concentrated assaults against specific sectors, aiming to penetrate the defensive belts in depth rather than spreading forces across the entire perimeter. This new approach led to the Battle of Dalnik on 17 to 18 September. Romanian artillery pounded Soviet positions for hours before infantry from the 21st Infantry Division advanced. The initial assault achieved a breach in the first line, capturing several trenches and bunkers. However, Soviet counterattacks, supported by naval gunfire and mortars, reclaimed much of the lost ground. The encounter illustrated the difficulty of holding gains without rapid exploitation and highlighted the defenders' ability to regroup quickly under fire. Inside Odessa, the civilian population faced worsening conditions. Food stocks, though supplemented by naval deliveries, were under strict rationing, with bread and basic staples prioritized for the military. Civil defense units worked tirelessly to repair damage from air raids and artillery strikes, while medical facilities struggled to treat both military and civilian casualties. Soviet authorities maintained strict order, using the NKVD to suppress dissent and prevent desertion. Morale was sustained through frequent public speeches, propaganda posters, and the broadcast of optimistic war bulletins. As September turned to October, Romanian forces began to employ siege tactics aimed at wearing down the defenders over time. Mines were laid to restrict Soviet sorties, and sappers worked to undermine fortifications in targeted sectors. Heavy artillery bombardments were intensified, with new batteries brought forward to within range of the port facilities. Axis air raids focused on infrastructure, attempting to disrupt the flow of supplies from the sea. These attacks damaged warehouses, cranes, and sections of the harbor, but Soviet repair crews worked continuously to restore operations. Meanwhile, the broader strategic picture was changing. In early October, German advances along the southern front threatened to encircle Odessa by cutting Soviet access routes from Crimea and the lower Dnieper. The Soviet High Command, recognizing the risk of isolation, began to plan for an organized evacuation of the city while continuing to hold the line as long as possible. The goal was to delay Axis capture until evacuation could be completed without catastrophic losses. By mid-October, signs of Soviet withdrawal became evident to Romanian reconnaissance units. Increased naval traffic out of the port and the redeployment of heavy artillery pieces suggested preparations for departure. However, Soviet forces maintained active defense to mask their intentions. For the Romanian command, the prospect of taking Odessa without a final costly assault was appealing, but there remained uncertainty about whether the defenders were conducting a feint or preparing for a decisive stand. The next phase of the operation would determine whether the siege ended with a breakthrough, a negotiated surrender, or a strategic withdrawal. In the final days of the siege, October 1941, the Soviet command executed one of the most organized large-scale evacuations on the Black Sea during the war. The decision, taken by the Stavka in coordination with the Black Sea Fleet, aimed to preserve the combat strength of the separate coastal army for future operations in Crimea. Preparations had been underway since early October, but were concealed under the guise of continued defensive activity to prevent Romanian and German forces from exploiting the withdrawal. On the 14th of October, the evacuation began in earnest. Soviet warships, transports, and auxiliary vessels moved under cover of darkness to Odessa's harbor, embarking troops, equipment, and essential supplies. The Black Sea Fleet coordinated the operation with naval infantry, providing perimeter security in the port area, while rearguard units held the outer defensive lines. Civilian volunteers and mobilized workers assisted in loading artillery, vehicles, and munitions onto ships. The evacuation was staged over several nights to minimize exposure to Axis aerial reconnaissance and bombing. Romanian forces, unaware of the full scope of Soviet intentions, continued siege operations during this period. Artillery barrages targeted known strongpoints, while probing attacks tested defensive reactions. In some sectors, resistance appeared to weaken, but Soviet counterfire still met any significant advance. The defenders' determination in these final days convinced Romanian intelligence that Odessa's garrison remained committed to holding the city, masking the scale of the withdrawal. By 16th of October, the main body of the Soviet garrison, estimated at over 8,000 personnel, had embarked for Sevastopol and other Crimean ports. Rearguard units, composed of select rifle and naval infantry detachments, covered the evacuation by conducting localized counterattacks and maintaining artillery fire. Demolition teams systematically destroyed military infrastructure, port facilities, and stockpiles that could not be evacuated. Mines and booby traps were left in abandoned positions to delay Axis exploitation. When Romanian reconnaissance units entered parts of the outer defensive belt on the 16th of October, they found positions lightly manned or abandoned. By afternoon, forward patrols reached the city outskirts, confirming that Soviet forces were in full retreat. Marshal Ion Antonescu ordered an immediate advance to secure the port before further sabotage could occur. The first Romanian units to enter Odessa encountered sporadic resistance from rearguard elements and sniper fire from concealed positions, but organized defense had collapsed. The capture of Odessa marked a significant political and military achievement for Romania. It was the largest independent operation undertaken by the Romanian army during the Second World War, and the only major port city they captured without direct German ground force leadership. The victory was proclaimed in Bucharest as a restoration of Romanian sovereignty on the Black Sea coast and a symbol of the nation's contribution to the Axis war effort. Official reports claimed the operation had cost Romanian forces approximately 92,000 casualties including killed, wounded, and missing, while Soviet losses were estimated at 6,000, though exact figures remain debated due to the evacuation. In the immediate aftermath, Romanian military authorities began securing the city and surrounding areas. Engineers worked to clear mines and unexploded ordnance, restore basic utilities, and repair port facilities damaged during the siege and Soviet demolitions. Odessa's civilian population, reduced during the siege due to evacuations and casualties, faced strict security measures, including curfews and identity checks. The Romanian administration re-established municipal governance but placed it under close military oversight. Occupation policies reflected both strategic and ideological aims. Odessa became the administrative center of the newly created Transnistria Governorate, a territory extending between the Dniester and southern Bug rivers, placed under Romanian civil administration. This zone included a mix of urban centers, agricultural lands, and war-damaged infrastructure. Romanian authorities aimed to integrate it economically with the home country, while exploiting resources to support the war effort. The occupation also brought intensified anti-Jewish measures, with mass deportations and executions carried out in the weeks following the city's capture, actions coordinated between Romanian military, gendarmerie, and security services. Despite the formal end of the siege, security in Odessa remained precarious. Sabotage, partisan activity, and clandestine Soviet networks operated within the city, conducting bombings and assassinations targeting Romanian personnel and collaborators. In response, the occupation administration instituted harsh reprisals, further deepening hostility among sections of the civilian population. These tensions ensured that, although Odessa had fallen militarily, it remained a contested space in political and security terms, foreshadowing the ongoing instability that would persist throughout the Romanian occupation of Transnistria. Through late 1941 and into 1942, the Romanian administration in Transnistria consolidated its control over the territory between the Dniester and the southern Bug, with Odessa as its administrative capital. Governor Gheorghe Alexianu, appointed by Marshal Ion Antonescu, oversaw both civil governance and coordination with the Romanian military command. His administration's mandate included restoring order, reviving economic activity, and exploiting resources to support the Axis war effort. Agricultural output, particularly grain and livestock, was requisitioned for shipment to Romania, while industrial facilities in Odessa were repaired where possible to produce goods for military use. The occupation brought sweeping demographic and political changes. One of the most consequential and tragic aspects was the systematic persecution of the Jewish population. In the immediate aftermath of the city's capture, mass shootings and deportations were carried out in reprisal for attacks on Romanian troops, and as part of Axis anti-Jewish policies. Large numbers of Jews from Odessa and surrounding areas were deported to camps and ghettos in rural Transnistria, where poor conditions, forced labor, and executions led to high mortality rates. Other targeted groups included Soviet political commissars, suspected partisans, and individuals associated with the former Soviet administration. Security was a constant concern for the Romanian authorities. Odessa remained a center of Soviet partisan and underground activity, with sabotage operations aimed at disrupting transport, damaging infrastructure, and assassinating occupation officials. On 26 October 1941, a major explosion in the Romanian military headquarters in Odessa killed over 60 officers and soldiers, including General Ion Glogogeanu. The blast, caused by explosives planted by Soviet operatives before the Romanian occupation, triggered a severe reprisal. Thousands of civilians, mostly Jews, were executed in the days that followed. These reprisals deepened local resentment and intensified the cycle of violence between occupation forces and resistance networks. Partisan activity in Transnistria was not limited to urban centers. Rural areas saw the formation of small, mobile groups that harassed Romanian garrisons, destroyed supply convoys, and relayed intelligence to Soviet forces across the southern Bug. In response, Romanian counterinsurgency operations combined military sweeps with intelligence work, often relying on local collaborators for information. These operations could be brutal, involving arrests, deportations, and destruction of villages suspected of aiding partisans. Despite the security challenges, the Romanian administration attempted to normalize daily life for those outside the targeted groups. Romanian schools were opened, Romanian language newspapers circulated, and Orthodox churches reopened after being closed or repurposed under Soviet rule. Efforts were made to restore public services, though shortages of fuel, building materials, and skilled labor limited progress. The war economy dominated all aspects of life, with food rationing, price controls, and compulsory labor requirements imposed on the population. For the Axis military effort, Transnistria's value lay in its position as a logistical base for operations in southern Ukraine and toward the Caucasus. The port of Odessa, once repaired, served as a supply hub, though it remained vulnerable to Soviet naval and air attacks. Romanian forces stationed in the governorate were tasked with securing the long front along the southern Bug, guarding against Soviet incursions, and maintaining internal stability. By mid-1942, this front became part of the rear area for the German summer offensive towards Stalingrad and the oil fields of the Caucasus. The relationship between Romania and Germany during this period was marked by both cooperation and underlying tension. While Germany recognized Romania's control over Transnistria, it retained significant influence over military operations and economic priorities. Romanian leaders hoped that their continued contribution to the Axis war effort would secure not only the permanent return of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, but also international recognition of their expanded holdings. However, as the Eastern Front shifted toward protracted warfare, the costs of occupation in manpower, resources, and political stability grew steadily. By the end of 1942, the war's momentum began to shift. The Axis defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943 and the Soviet counteroffensives placed renewed pressure on all sectors of the Eastern Front, including southern Ukraine. Romanian forces, stretched thin between frontline duties and occupation tasks, faced the prospect of fighting a defensive campaign far from their home territory. The stability of the Transnistria governorate, already fragile, would soon be tested by the accelerating Soviet advance and the unraveling of Axis positions in the south. The year 1943 marked a turning point for the Axis position in southern Ukraine and, by extension, for Romania's hold over Transnistria, Bessarabia, and northern Bukovina. The defeat at Stalingrad in February shattered the German Sixth Army and forced a broad retreat along the Eastern Front. Soviet offensives, spearheaded by the southwestern and southern fronts, began to push westward, liberating territory in the Donbass and threatening the lower Dnieper. While the main Soviet thrust in early 1943 focused north of Transnistria, the rapid change in momentum signaled that Romanian-occupied territories would eventually become a frontline zone. Romanian forces in the region were increasingly under strain. Divisions stationed in Transnistria were short of replacements, their equipment worn down after 2 years of occupation duties and sporadic combat. Supply shortages worsened as German logistical priorities shifted toward stabilizing the central sectors of the Eastern Front. Ammunition, fuel, and winter clothing were in limited supply, and transport networks suffered from both partisan sabotage and the sheer wear of constant use. The port of Odessa, still operational, became a critical resupply point, but was targeted by Soviet air raids and submarine activity in the Black Sea. Partisan warfare intensified in 1943 as the Soviet command expanded its underground networks in the occupied territories. In Transnistria, partisan detachments increased both in number and operational capability. They targeted rail lines, bridges, and fuel depots, forcing the Romanian garrison to divert significant manpower to security duties. In Bessarabia, similar activity disrupted communication and transport, undermining the Romanian ability to reinforce the front or move supplies efficiently. The NKVD's coordinated efforts ensured that partisan actions coincided with larger Soviet offensives, amplifying their impact. The political situation in Bucharest also began to reflect the mounting pressures of the war. Although Marshal Antonescu remained committed to the Axis alliance, discontent was growing among segments of the Romanian political elite, military officers, and even the general population. Heavy casualties on the Eastern Front, combined with the economic burden of sustaining both frontline troops and occupation forces, strained national resources. Food shortages, inflation, and war weariness eroded support for the continuation of hostilities. By mid-1943, the strategic outlook further deteriorated for the Axis after the Battle of Kursk in July ended in a decisive Soviet defensive victory. The subsequent Soviet offensives in the south broke through German and Romanian defensive positions along the Mias and Dnieper lines. The German Sixth Army, reconstituted after Stalingrad, and the Romanian Third and Fourth Armies were forced into a series of fighting withdrawals toward the Black Sea and the Dniester River. This retreat brought the war's front closer to Romanian-administered territory, triggering preparations for defensive operations along the Transnistrian front. In Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, the Romanian military began strengthening defensive positions, constructing field fortifications, and laying minefields along likely Soviet approach routes. The 1940-1941 memories of rapid Soviet advances made Romanian planners determined to delay any future offensives. However, shortages of concrete, barbed wire, and engineering equipment limited the scope of these efforts. German advisors emphasized the importance of mobile defense, but Romanian forces lacked the mechanized reserves needed to implement such strategies effectively. As winter approached in late 1943, Soviet forces advanced into southern Ukraine, capturing key cities such as Melitopol and pushing toward the lower Dnieper crossings. Although Odessa and Transnistria remained in Axis hands, their security was increasingly precarious. The Soviet Black Sea Fleet intensified its operations, launching raids on coastal installations and attempting to disrupt Axis shipping routes. Romanian naval units, supplemented by small German contingents, engaged in defensive patrols, convoy escort missions, and mine-laying operations, but could not fully neutralize the threat. By the end of the year, it was evident to both Romanian and German commands that a major Soviet offensive into Bessarabia was likely in 1944. The Axis position in the south was now a deep salient vulnerable to encirclement from multiple directions. The Romanian High Command faced a strategic dilemma: maintain large forces in Transnistria to defend territory far from Romania's natural frontiers, or begin a phased withdrawal to more defensible positions along the Prut River. The decision would ultimately be shaped not in Bucharest, but by the pace and scale of the Soviet winter-spring offensives that were about to unfold. The winter of 1943-1944 brought no respite to Axis forces in southern Ukraine. In March 1944, the Red Army launched the Uman-Bodoshani offensive, part of a broader series of operations aimed at destroying German Army Group South and its Romanian allies. The 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts, commanded by Marshals Ivan Konev and Rodion Malinovsky, concentrated overwhelming strength against Axis positions along the Dniester and the Bug. Soviet forces deployed more than 500,000 troops, supported by over 8,000 artillery pieces and mortars, 500 tanks and self-propelled guns, and hundreds of aircraft. In contrast, the Romanian and German units defending Transnistria and Bessarabia were heavily outnumbered, understrength, and short on equipment. The offensive began with powerful artillery bombardments, followed by deep armored thrusts that penetrated weak points in the Axis lines. The German Sixth Army, together with the Romanian Third and Fourth Armies, attempted to hold defensive positions along the Bug and Dniester rivers, but quickly came under pressure from multiple Soviet bridgeheads. In several sectors, Soviet armored spearheads bypassed strongpoints, isolating Axis units and forcing them into costly withdrawals under constant air and artillery attack. By mid-March, Soviet troops crossed the Dniester in force, threatening Odessa directly. The Romanian Fourth Army, tasked with defending the city once more, faced the prospect of encirclement. Antonescu's government requested German reinforcement, but the Wehrmacht, stretched thin by simultaneous Soviet offensives in the north and center, could only spare limited reserves. German commanders urged an immediate evacuation of Transnistria to avoid a repeat of Stalingrad, but Antonescu hesitated, hoping for a temporary stabilization of the front. The Soviet advance was relentless. On 24th of March 1944, they captured Tiraspol, the capital of the Moldavian ASSR before 1940, cutting one of the main Axis supply routes to Odessa. With Soviet armor pushing west toward the Black Sea, Romanian commanders recognized that holding Odessa was impossible without risking the loss of their forces. Preparations for evacuation began in early April, mirroring the Soviet withdrawal of 1941, but now in reverse. Romanian and German units systematically destroyed port facilities, warehouses, and transport infrastructure to deny their use to the enemy. The evacuation of Odessa took place under constant Soviet pressure. Rearguard actions by Romanian infantry divisions delayed Soviet advance long enough for the majority of Axis troops to embark on ships or withdraw overland toward the Dniester, and then the Prut River. By 10th of April 1944, Soviet forces entered Odessa, greeted by surviving civilians as liberators. The recapture of the city restored Soviet control over the Black Sea coast west of Crimea and provided a strategic base for further operations into Bessarabia. Following the fall of Odessa, the focus of fighting shifted to Bessarabia itself. The Soviet High Command sought to destroy Axis forces in the region before they could establish strong defensive positions along the Prut. The first Jassy-Kishinev offensive, launched in April-May 1944, aimed to capture Chisinau and Jassy, Iași through converging attacks. However, Romanian and German forces, fighting on shorter supply lines and benefiting from prepared defensive positions, managed to hold the line after weeks of heavy combat. Both sides suffered significant casualties, and the offensive was ultimately halted, giving the Axis a temporary reprieve. This lull was deceptive. The Soviet command used the summer of 1944 to regroup, bring in fresh divisions, and stockpile supplies for a decisive blow. In contrast, Romanian morale was deteriorating. News of Soviet advances elsewhere, and the destruction of Army Group Center in Operation Bagration in June 1944 heightened fears that Romania's turn for decisive defeat was near. Political divisions in Bucharest deepened, with some factions urging a break from Germany and negotiation with the Allies, while Antonescu remained committed to fighting alongside the Wehrmacht. By August 1944, the Soviet 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts were ready to launch the second Jassy-Kishinev offensive. This operation would shatter Axis defenses in Bessarabia, bring the Red Army to Romania's pre-war borders, and trigger political upheaval in Bucharest. For both Romanian and Soviet soldiers, the coming battle would mark the culmination of 4 years of shifting front lines, repeated occupations, and devastating losses in the contested lands between the Prut and Dniester. On 20th of August 1944, the second Jassy-Kishinev offensive began with one of the most concentrated artillery barrages of the Eastern Front. The Soviet 2nd Ukrainian Front under Marshal Rodion Malinovsky and the 3rd Ukrainian Front under Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin struck simultaneously along the Axis lines in Bessarabia. Against them stood the German 6th Army and the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies, altogether numbering roughly 400,000 men. But many Romanian units were understrength, poorly equipped, and exhausted from months of defensive fighting. Soviet forces committed over 900,000 troops, supported by approximately 1,300 tanks and self-propelled guns, 16,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and nearly 1,000 aircraft, ensuring overwhelming numerical and material superiority. The main Soviet thrust targeted the sectors near Targu Frumos, Chisinau, and the lower Dniester. Within the first day, Soviet armored and mechanized corps broke through German-Romanian defensive belts, exploiting weaknesses in coordination between Axis units. By 22nd August, Soviet spearheads had advanced tens of kilometers, encircling large Axis formations east of the Prut. Communications collapsed as Soviet cavalry mechanized groups cut key roads and rail lines. Romanian divisions, often lacking anti-tank weaponry, capable of stopping T-34-85s and IS-2 heavy tanks, were rapidly overrun or forced into disorderly retreats. The encirclement east of Chisinau trapped much of the German 6th Army along with several Romanian divisions. Soviet forces tightened the ring through coordinated assaults from multiple directions, supported by constant airstrikes. Attempts at breakout failed under heavy artillery and air bombardment. Thousands of Axis soldiers were captured, including German General Karl Adolf Hollett's command staff. Romanian units suffered catastrophic losses, with entire regiments ceasing to exist as coherent fighting forces. While the military disaster unfolded, the political situation in Bucharest reached a breaking point. On 23 August 1944, King Michael I, supported by opposition political leaders and elements of the army, arrested Marshal Ion Antonescu and announced Romania's immediate cessation of hostilities against the Allies. The new government declared war on Germany, ordering Romanian forces to turn their weapons on former Axis partners. This abrupt realignment caught many German units in Romania by surprise, leading to clashes as the Wehrmacht attempted to withdraw toward Hungary. For Soviet operations, the Romanian coup accelerated their advance. The Red Army quickly occupied Bucharest and moved westward with Romanian assistance, capturing key transportation hubs and preventing German forces from regrouping. In Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, Soviet control was re-established by the end of August. The Moldavian SSR, recreated from most of Bessarabia, was reintegrated into the Soviet Union, while northern Bukovina returned to the Ukrainian SSR. Soviet security forces moved rapidly to suppress any potential resistance, reimposing the administrative, political, and economic systems dismantled by Romania in 1941. The civilian impact of this final phase was profound. Refugee movements swelled as people fled advancing armies, fearing reprisals or conscription. In many areas, property changed hands multiple times over the course of the war, leaving disputes unresolved and records destroyed. The new Soviet administration resumed collectivization of agriculture, renationalization of industry, and political repression of those associated with the Romanian occupation or anti-Soviet activities. Deportations and arrests targeted former Romanian officials, landowners, and suspected collaborators. In military terms, the Second Jassy-Kishinev offensive was one of the most complete Soviet victories of the war, annihilating an entire German army group and removing Romania from the Axis coalition. The operation cleared the path for the Red Army's advance into the Balkans, opening routes into Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and eventually Hungary. For Romania, the switch of allegiance shortened the war on its territory, but could not prevent Soviet occupation and the imposition of a pro-Moscow government. The legacy of these events in Moldova was long-lasting. The alternating occupations between 1940 and 1944 had devastated infrastructure, agriculture, and industry, while political repression under both Soviet and Romanian administrations left deep scars in the population. Ethnic tensions, wartime atrocities, and mass displacements reshaped the demographic and cultural landscape. Post-war Soviet Moldova became both a showcase for Soviet reconstruction and a tightly controlled border republic. Its history during the war remembered through competing narratives shaped by political agendas in Moscow, Bucharest, and later, independent Moldova. The shifting front lines and competing claims during the conflict cemented Moldova's identity as a land between two geopolitical giants, caught in the currents of one of history's most destructive wars.